when I was starting out, I was a comparative politics specialist, and I worked on Europe and the United States mainly, but especially on France, because I spent a year as an undergraduate student at Sciences Po in Paris, studying French politics in some depth. I decided while I was there that if I wanted to learn something that they could teach me that I probably couldn't learn anywhere else, I'd specialize in French politics. And that was a key time. That was in the mid-'60s when General de Gaulle was still around, and then shortly followed, by the way, by the May 1968 uprisings and all that sort of thing in Paris, which I followed, and I was there just before it happened and all that sort of thing. But I went into studying French economic policy, especially under Mitterrand when he became president, because I was wondering, to what extent socialist economic policies could be made to work. And of course, as we all know, they weren't really made to work, even under Mitterrand, certainly not later under Hollande, the next socialist president. So I was looking around, and I actually came to the conclusion that economic policymakers in Western capitalist countries, probably all over the world actually, were sufficiently hindered and limited by what was going on internationally. And that led me into looking at international political economy as predicting the kinds of things that could happen that you couldn't do by looking at domestic political economy and straightforward, marketization, welfare states, et cetera, et cetera. The limits came from the international and from the increasing globalization and transnationalization of the international economic system. So that's how I got into IPE. And I guess by the middle of the 1980s, I definitely shifted from being in comparative politics and political economy to being in international politics, except that I did early on come to the conclusion that international was the wrong word, because it's international and it assumes that the system is based on nation states as the fundamental nodes of the system. And I came to think that the French had got it right when they called it politique mondiale, world politics. And I've tried to use that phrase ever since, world political economy and world politics and the interconnection between the two. I don't know how much farther to go on that, but by the time I finished writing on French stuff, which was in the mid to late 1980s, I was well into IPE, or the version of IPE, or world political economy. And that was what shaped my book, my 1990 book, The Changing Architecture of Politics. Although that focused more on the changing nature of the state rather than on the whole system.
Do you think that the experience in France, and then earlier we were talking about you being in what was then Czechoslovakia, do you think that had an influence on your intellectual development?
Oh yes, because it seemed to me that we were living in a world which was, people use the word globalization, which I think has some problems to it, because I prefer sort of transnationalization or sort of, as you know, I call it the dialectic of globalization and fragmentation, which Jim Rosenau used to call fragmigration. And it seems to me that it's a process that's going on. It's a process that sociologists call structuration. And we're in a phase of restructuring the world political economy and world society and world economics generally. And we don't know where we're going with that. That's the issue. And that's what my whole career has been, sort of trying to make sense of where we're coming from and where we're going. And I do think that, and again, what's the role of the nation state? I could go on about this now if you want me to, but it seems to me that in this kind of context, it's not that the state is sort of losing power entirely, the way some critics of globalization theory would say. It's that the state is finding what they call state capacity is being narrowed in a variety of ways, and the state has become, and I only started using this term last year. I think a couple of other people have used it, but I invented it myself, but other people have used it before me. that the state is becoming a reactive state. In other words, as all these changes are taking place, financialization, global value chains of various kinds of problems to do with development, various kinds of problems to do with different crises coming along in different sectors. It seems to me that what you've got is a process which is becoming messier and messier. And I don't know where it's going. Yesterday, I finished reading Arrighi's book, The Long 20th Century. And even though he has some very good things to say and a lot of very, very interesting what he thinks of as historical parallels.
And insightful, given what he wrote.
To discuss. Yeah. But the point, my critique of him is that he says that he still accepts that states are the nodes of what's going to happen next, and where we are now is sort of the latest stage of a process of Americanization of the international political economy. And I think it's gone well beyond Americanization at this point.
Sure. I mean, one of the things you picked up on already there is, we're getting into your kind of areas of contribution. And you were one of the first people talking about early, globalization and so on, and your take on the state and the competition state and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to introduce students now to that idea of the competition state, I wondered if you'd have any particular way you wanted to introduce it, but also any reflections now, given what is 20, however many years since you came up with that idea, whether there are differences in how you would kind of describe that now, given the passage of time in between.
Well, I think what I would say is that the competition state is still a crucial necessity. There's a word I want. It sets parameters that have to be followed, but that doesn't mean it's successful. And in many cases, it's not very successful. I mean, if you look at the concept of the competition state, for example, and this is a little bit more of an extreme position, but if you look at it in terms of what's called the developing world or the third world or the emerging economies or whatever, what you've got are, and thanks to Donald Trump for starting to use this term, fake states. They're states that were set up post-colonially. They were often set up with the support of the former colonial powers. They were set up by very often corrupt authoritarian rulers with their private, supporters and private armies and that sort of thing. And they were not very good, most of them, with the exception of the really big ones like China and India, were not very good at competing. I mean, they could compete for simple things, for simple agricultural produce and that sort of thing, but they couldn't actually develop. And the original model, which is called import substitution industrialization, really has not taken flight in most of this so-called emerging world. And what you have is, even though to some extent there's been, as Milanovic points out, there's been a reduction of overall poverty. That's mainly in China and India. That's not necessarily in all sorts of parts of Africa, which is absolutely huge and which needs to be developed in a different way. And then, of course, in Latin America, you get your authoritarian rulers coming back, all that sort of thing. So, and I haven't even touched on the role of China yet, which I think is extremely important.
So, if we were trying to think about your intellectual development then, and the kind of contributions that you've made to international political economy, and well beyond as well, actually. So this kind of idea of the competition state's really crucial. How do you get from the competition state to the more recent work on something like transnational neopluralism?
Well, I've stopped using the term transnational neopluralism because I think it's a little bit too complicated. Although I think I explained it reasonably well in the book on it, Rethinking World Politics. But I've come increasingly, after talking with a whole bunch of people in workshops over the past few years, people like Shahar Hameri and Lee Jones and Tom Pegram and that sort of thing, they introduced me to the concept of heterarchy. Now, we seem to, and in fact, an awful lot of analysts of international relations are still, caught, imprisoned by the notion that the international system is anarchical and states are hierarchical, which, of course, is the basis of Kenneth Waltz's neorealism. It seems to me that what you've got now is not anarchy versus hierarchy, but a variety of intermediate structures and processes, which link to what Anne-Marie Slaughter called the disaggregated state, and which lead to the things that I talked about already: global value chains, that sort of thing, financialization. I'm supposedly writing on financialization at the moment. I think that's an absolutely crucial issue area to deal with. So we're dealing with a world in which, all right, I'm gonna put this in a slightly different way. I've said this, that when I was an undergraduate back in the 1960s, there was a huge growing literature on in American politics, the study of America, although it did spill over into other countries, on pressure groups and interest groups. And the idea was there that you saw the role of these pressure groups and interest groups, not just putting pressure on government, but actually controlling certain bureaucratic processes and certain political processes. It's not exactly corruption, but corruption is part of it. But it's basically determining what the policy outcomes are going to be. And that these specific areas, especially if you're talking about different economic sectors, different social sectors, these different areas and issue areas become more and more important and in terms of determining what kinds of outcomes you get. And what I'm trying to do in the concept of heterarchy, that, as I say, I inherited, but I'm using increasingly. I've been asked to edit a book for Routledge on heterarchy. The concept of heterarchy is that you have these blocks in different sectors, organized differently, that basically involve capture and reverse capture, as the theorists of pressure groups used to say, of bureaucratic and political policy making processes, so that you come out with, just the ability to combine states and markets in a single process, but it varies by issue area, by sector. And by that, I actually found it quite useful some years ago now to read Oliver Williamson's work on markets and hierarchies, or markets, hierarchies, and networks, in which he develops the thesis that there are different kinds of assets that are crucial in different sectors, and sometimes these assets are highly specific to that sector. In other words, they can't be marketized or shifted around very easily, so they lead to oligopolization and monopolization. There are hierarchies within those sectors. And there are other sectors which he calls characterized by non-specific assets, where you can actually, break off part of the sector and sell it to somebody else, and the sectors can get mixed up, and sometimes these develop wider, uneven networks. It's a very uneven process, the markets, hierarchies, and networks process. And I think, Williamson and his focus on asset specificity, as the phrase goes, really affected shaped my work for quite some time, because I think I came across him basically in the 1980s and 90s. So that's my view, that we live in a heterarchical world which is dominated by some combination of private interests and parts of the disaggregated state, and also to some extent parts of disaggregated global governance, because there isn't a proper coherent structure of global governance. And some of the work on this has been in recent years has been called work on regime complexes. The problem is I've been to conference panels on regime complexes. And the problem that I find with it is that they don't bring in the private sector enough. They talk about regime complexes as complexes of quasi-public governmental structures rather than as heterarchical structures which combine private and public and bring those private interests into the policymaking process. And I think my current work on financialization is absolutely crucial on this because, well, you look at the deregulatory processes and the internationalization processes that led up to the Minsky moment of 2007, 2008, which I lived through. Of course, I was in the United States at the time and trying to make sense of it. And I was, selling and buying flats at the time. So mortgage-based securities were an issue for me personally, as well as for economic policymakers. It did seem to me that, first of all, as a number of people have pointed out, that the financial system, international financial system, is crisis bent. It moves towards crisis in various ways, but also that governments, in trying to deal with it, cannot actually control the financial system because it's too transnationalized, it's too internationalized. They can't control it. And by the way, there's a book that I think is out this year or last year that I've just finished reading called Firefighting, which is a book supposedly written, presumably ghostwritten, but supposedly written by Ben Bernanke, Tim Geithner, and Hank Paulson, the three main policymakers dealing with both the build-up to and the impact of the financial crisis and the Great Recession that took place 12 years ago, and is in some ways still around. And basically, if you read what they say, they're celebrating their own success at firefighting, but they see themselves as simply propping up the existing financial system and making it work. And it's interesting that because I'm going to have to go back to this book and have another look at it again in terms of the things I'm writing. But in the last couple of chapters, they basically say, but there are certain things we couldn't do, and we hope maybe one day we'll be able to do it in terms of coming up with some kind of transnational or global regulatory system that will prevent these crises from happening in the future. But they're basically saying that what they did was just propping up the system and not creating the potential for being able to control it. And that seems to me, I regard the international financial system as the most important heterarchical structure in a very uneven world of different heterarchical structures. I think the international finance, they can lobby, they have a sort of intellectual lobby as well, because a lot of the policymakers simply agree with what they're saying because they start off from a traditional economic point of view that financial markets will eventually balance out and control themselves. And I think that's more and more problematic.
I'm always reminded of a well-known classical Marxist scholar who described you as a Marxist who'd not
a closet Marxist.
A closet Marxist.
This is Paul Kammerer.
Who'd not. How did he describe you as a Marxist who'd not read Marx, or?
Oh, I've read a bit of Marx.
Something like that.
I think that's highly problematic in various ways. Yeah, because I think there's a kind of wholeness, holistic dimension of Marxist theory. The classes. I think classes are much more divided up. I think classes are much more pluralistic. What we're talking about is, to some extent, what Dahl called polyarchy. Rather than there being a proper, coherent, united capitalist class, undermining or going against what will become an increasingly united and coherent working class. I don't think either of those are true. I certainly think the working class is very much undermined by all these things, but the working class itself is obviously partly bought off by wages, especially in not just the developed countries, but in other parts of the developing world as well. So I don't think that there is a revolutionary possibility. There's another word I'm trying to think of for possibility coming out of this. I don't think you're going to get any kind of proper revolution. You'll get mini revolutions of various kinds, and sometimes small pressure groups, Occupy and that sort of thing, or Extinction Rebellion, which kind of are around the margins of what's actually happening in the world. I just think this is a little bit when we were talking earlier about neopluralism, and the very concept of neopluralism is that you have pluralism, but the rich guys benefit from it and come out on top in the end. And I think that's the kind of world we're living in. And I certainly don't believe that you could ever have a kind of Marxist revolutionary society in which people became equal and what's the phrase, the famous Marxist phrase, when you've got the society set up, the people don't require money anymore. There's a famous phrase from Marx.
You've caught me napping, and I should know, shouldn't I? But
each to their own, according to their
need. Yeah.
Yes, that's the one.
Oh, the one, right? From each according to their
abilities,
needs,
to each according to their needs. Yes.
Roles.
I don't believe that you could ever have a society other than maybe a village based on those kinds of principles, as lovely as they are. So in that sense, I'm not a Marxist, but there are certain aspects of Marx's analysis of how capitalist societies develop up to a point, which I certainly would be sympathetic with. But I certainly wouldn't. I certainly think to call myself a Marxist would actually be to deflect the ideas from where they're actually going. You become, in a way, Marxists may be pessimists, but in another way, Marxists are extremely optimistic about the possible future. And it's interesting today in the way in which the concept of socialism is being used. Here we have Donald Trump saying that Joe Biden is a socialist who wants to create a Marxist society. I mean, what a load of rubbish. I mean, I can see why he wants to use that in terms of propaganda, discourse, etc. But I mean, the whole thing is, we are in a capitalist society. In many ways, society is becoming even more capitalistic, even more controlled by these various kinds of types of capitalists in their different sectors. And we have to find some way of dealing with that. And I suppose, if we're talking about going back to our discussion about Williamson, Williamson's discussion is very much like, it's a bit different from, but very much like the concept which is usually widely accepted among economists of public goods and private goods. And I don't see at the moment a way of invigorating or improving our production of public goods in the kind of international economy we have now.
Okay. The other thing I wondered about was you've raised it, and you were one of the first people to talk about it, and it's now the thing to talk about. What was it that prompted you to start focusing on finance in particular?
Oh, I think it was back in the 80s and 90s when I was writing on French politics and comparative politics. It did seem to me that it was the internationalization of finance which was limiting the possible role of the state domestically in all these countries as well as internationally. Yeah, so, I wrote about finance. One of the things that I wrote about finance, which I'm going to be putting in the introduction to this chapter, this handbook chapter I'm supposed to be writing on business and politics and finance and politics, is the notion that what makes finance different from every other sector is that it's so abstract. In other words, anything can be converted using computers or whatever into money. Money is totally abstract in the way that maybe once upon a time it wasn't, when you had these sort of medieval coins of various kinds. But increasingly, especially as information and communications technology develops, intangibles, as they say, everything is money in the end, and that's both the problem. Also, I mean, obviously, if you could control finance in a positive way that help to develop public goods, help to develop the public interest, common interests, etc., that would be fine. But in a heterarchical world, you can't do that. And finance, it seems to me, is by far the most internationalized sector. It's by far the most dominant sector in the sense that it's characterized increasingly by what one analyst, I think originally from the IMF, I'm trying to remember now, called financial alchemy. In other words, you keep borrowing to buy securities that are based on somebody else's borrowing. And so it's all increasing. It's not just indebtedness in sort of the total, although that's very important. It's the way it goes round and round and round. And that's why you get the Minsky moments of collapse. Because once an important group cannot pay its debts back, then that goes around the system. Well, all I can say about China, because I'm obviously not a specialist on China, is that I remember back in the early 2000s when I was lecturing on IPE, as we called it then. I basically said that the international system, the international economy is going to have to develop in the sort of way that China shifts from simply producing cheap exports for mass markets abroad and move up a stage in terms of its technological development, in terms of moving towards the third and fourth industrial revolutions. And therefore, if China is going to maintain the kind of political system that it has, it's going to have to concentrate on reforming the economy, restructuring the economy. And I think that's the basic problem that they're facing, because of course they have these, they've got a system where the government basically bails out the state-owned firms that don't do well, that they try to promote the markets, but they also limit the markets, and that I think they're overly dependent, obviously, on the dictator, Xi Jinping and that sort of thing. So I think China is to some extent at the crossroads, and I like the work very much of Lee Jones and Shahar Hameri, pointing out that China is not like a single hierarchical system, but is actually breaking apart in various ways, especially around the periphery. And I'm going to have a chapter from them in my book on heterarchy. On heterarchy, by the way, I do regard that as my main nowadays. But I've said the same thing for the last 30 years. Back in 2009, I had an article which you will remember called Multinodal Politics, which is basically the same thing. Then there was transnational neopluralism, which is basically the same thing. But I've got an article, a joint co-authored article coming out in the Journal of Political Power. I don't know if you know JPP, but it's the House Journal of the International Political Science Association Research Committee number 36, Political Power, which I've been doing.
Snappy title.
Yes, exactly, which I've been involved with since the early 1980s, founded by David Baldwin, I think. There's a special issue called The Changing Faces of Power, which is coming out, I think, in January. And this friend, Rosalba Belmonte, and I have this article called Heterarchy Towards Paradigm Shift in World Politics. And that's going to be the basis for the book as well. She's going to do a separate chapter, take her bits out of the paper we did together. I'm going to do an introductory chapter and a chapter on finance. I've just suggested a chapter on. I've just suggested a chapter on migration studies. There's going to be a chapter from somebody at, I think, the University of North Carolina, who's been writing about heterarchy from a social anthropological point of view for the last 20 years. And I only recently came across her work. She's quite well known, I think, in the anthropological theory field. I'm trying to think. There's going to be a chapter on gender by Fabian at the University of Ottawa. Anyway, I'm trying to put together both theoretical chapters and a few case studies. But the main issue will be to what. Oh yes, there's going to be something on urban politics as well, from somebody in Romania, I think, who I met at a conference once. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of places to go, a lot of future to the concept of heterarchy, because I do think it actually brings together all these things that I've been talking about in a way that is summarized in a single word. And I've not found something that summarized it in a single word before. I've tried polycentrism, and I've tried polyarchy, and I've tried all sorts of other things. But I'm still looking, after 35 years, I'm still looking for a single word that summarizes heterarchy.
Okay, but you were so keen on putting words together to begin with. You were like, you did the Giddens thing with the structuration and.
Well, that's true. Yeah, and especially in changing architecture of politics. That's right. Yeah.
And just as an aside, I'm somewhat disappointed, given all the arguments we had about transnational neopluralism, that you've ditched it.
All right. You like that concept?
Well, I remember arguing with you, and you were so certain about that one.
Well, I only ditched it because it was a clumsy word, clumsy phrase. Just like I really liked Jim Rosenau's concept of fragmigration, but I think it's incredibly clumsy. Nobody uses it. What do you mean, fragmigration? And then so we've got an even clumsier phrase, which is this dialectic of globalization and fragmentation, with that article that I did with Alex Pritchard a couple of years ago, et cetera, et cetera.
Didn't you at one point you were using the idea of was it the new medievalism?
Oh yes, no, that's still true, and I'm actually jointly authoring an article with a PhD student in Warsaw, who has been writing her thesis on neo-medievalism, and I've been talking. Actually, I've got a neighbor who's a medieval historian, and the other day we were out in the street talking, and I said, "Will you look at this article on neo-medievalism that came out in 1998? Will you read it and tell me whether it's a load of bullshit or whether you think actually I've got a point to make?" Because neo-medievalism was a very popular concept in the 1990s, but it's kind of dropped out of the discussion to some extent. But the idea is that you have all these different kinds of blocks which are both cutting across above what's the term? The terms I use in a variety of ways, that you've got structures that are above the state, below the state, and cutting across the state. And I think those to some extent are determined more by the economics of the situation than by what we would think of as the politics.
Fantastic.
You should just as an aside, not this as part of this. Have you read Toby Carroll and Daryl Jarvis's work?
No.
No. Toby uses this notion of above, beyond, and
in, through, and
around the state.
Right.
And they're good.
So, but does he have a one word?
The search for the single word.
No, but the point about hierarchy,
they're good friends with
I think is different. The point
and
about hierarchy is that I think is slightly different. It's because, like the concept of interest groups or special interest groups, that came up in domestic politics in the mid 20th century. It actually focuses on the increasingly determining role or the capturing role of private interests, because private interests organize transnationally in ways that governments can't. Governance institutions, people are always sort of shifting around governance, playing them off against each other. There's a phrase I'm trying to think of where they're playing.
Arbitrage.
Well, arbitrage is one word, but that's not what I'm thinking of. Anyway, I'll probably think of it later, and I'll let you know. So I actually think that the issue here is that, and maybe this is a sort of quasi-partial Marxist thing, is that private interests determine the outcomes. And certainly the notion of the nation state, which is the state would determine the outcomes, especially when you got fascism and all that sort of thing. And the defeat of fascism and the increasing globalization of the economy well, actually it started in the 19th century, but after the Second World War and into the 1960s and 70s, with the euro dollar market and all that sort of thing. I think private interests, but the thing is that private interests aren't unified. They're competing private interests.
You've spoken a lot about the kind of substantive study and issues in IPE, and I wondered if we could get to the kind of more the Phil of the Phil Cerny, if you like, the more kind of you as a person.
Right.
And obviously you've got this interest in transatlantic background. You moved around various institutions that have clearly helped your thinking through, and so on. So where were you at university before you even went to France studying?
Oh, I was at
that.
a fairly conservative American small college in the Midwest in Ohio, which I disliked. I actually had been a scholarship student at the equivalent of a British public school, an American private prep school, because my mother believed that the best educational system in the world was the British public school system. She'd lived part of her youth in Britain. And all right, you want to get to me.
Well, I just, a sense of how you got into the work, and the transatlantic stuff is really important to you.
She taught me to read at the age of 3. So when I went to school, I could already read, and I was way ahead of all the other kids, and I was a troublemaker. And so I went to state schools, the American public schools, and the teachers didn't know what to do with me. So she panicked and she and my grandmother, who was also very right-wing in this sense, put me into the private school system. And I went through the private school system. I didn't get into Harvard because my grades weren't good enough. So I went to this, quite intellectual small college in Ohio. But then I spent my summer between my first 2 years. It's a 4-year system in America. I spent my summer hitchhiking around Europe. Right. I was supposed to go over there for a job, a summer job, and then I decided this job is really boring. And I noticed that this in the 60s, us hippies could just hitchhike everywhere. So I went and I hitchhiked all around Italy and France. I spent a little bit of time in Britain. So yeah. I mean, my first hitch was to Innsbruck, from Bavaria. Anyway, so that's when I decided that I wanted to do a junior year abroad, as they call it, in France. And when I got into Sciences Po, which is called, in those days it wasn't, Sciences Po was just a nickname. It was the Institut d'études politiques. But I really loved that year. And that's when I decided that I had to go back to Europe for my postgraduate work. And that's why I was so pleased to get a teaching assistantship, or actually technically it was a research assistantship, but it was basically the same as a teaching assistantship at Manchester. So I went from graduating from a small college in Ohio to Manchester, where I had connections with various kinds of people with international connections, like a guy called Ghiza Ionescu, who wrote a lot about Eastern European politics, and eventually was my supervisor. And he published my first article in Government and Opposition. When I had just finished my postgraduate work, it was coming out just as I was taking up a job at a youthful age. I was still only 24, I believe, when I got my lectureship at the University of York, which was still a new university. I applied for about 200 jobs when I was there, and I spent years I spent time on leave at Sciences Po, at Harvard, at Dartmouth College, and at New York University, while I was at York, desperate to get out. And eventually, because I did publish so much, I eventually got a chair at Leeds, and then after a few years, I got a chair at Manchester, and then I got headhunted for this job in the States, which I stuck out for 6 years. A strange place, but quite good actually in many ways. And took early retirement. and came back here primarily because of had been active for 30 years in the Black Swan Folk Club because I'm a folk singer on the side. So that's me.
Okay, and the stuff that you just told us about, so travelling around Europe in the 60s as a self-identifying hippie,
Absolutely.
even if in retrospect.
Playing my guitar on the streets.
Right. So did that teach you anything, or did that stimulate anything in terms of politics and political economy?
Yes, definitely. Because when I was a teenager, I was a Goldwaterite, libertarian conservative. When I came to Europe, I thought, oh gosh, social democracy works, and I became a social democrat as a result of those travels.
Right. Wow. And what about some of the people you met along the way? I think before we started, you mentioned, for instance, Susan Strange, and you mentioned...
That was later.
Right,
that was
okay.
Later, yeah. When I was at York, yeah.
Are there particular people that have, not necessarily always in academic citation terms, but have influenced your thinking or career as you've gone through?
Oh, well, I mean, there were all sorts of people that I met up with at various times, not necessarily in IPE. I mean, for example, being in that political power IPSA group with people like David Baldwin was really quite important. I'm trying to think. There are some others other than just Susan, but I can't think of them just at the moment.
And what was your experience with Susan Strange?
Oh, we met at a conference. We were drinking and talking, and I thought, this is what I want to be doing, the sort of stuff that she was doing. And then I had already started reading some of her work, which I really liked. I mean, I think she was right on in a variety of ways. And I gather from other people who've told me that she liked my work. So I'm very pleased. I was very honored about that.
Strong personality? Yeah.
Her?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And also, one of the things I liked, because I went to some of her seminars. I actually had her up to Manchester to give seminars and that sort of thing, was the fact that, like me, she didn't over-prepare. She would go in, she'd have a few notes, and she would talk for an hour. And in fact, that's the way I've always tended to organize, as you know, my lectures and that sort of thing, because just like today with my notes here, I'm a good bullshitter. And I've had students tell me that they really liked my lectures, even when those lectures were only based on half a page of notes.
And other than not liking York, were there particular things that being in specific institutions did in terms of influencing your development?
Well, I think York was a particular problem because they hadn't let me teach international politics until the mid-1980s, the late 1980s. So I'd been there for many years without being able to teach what I regarded as my real subject.
So going to, when you eventually went to Manchester, that must have been important for you. I remember helping you.
Leeds was the important one because I was asked to be an external examiner at Leeds. And then they had a chair come up, which I applied for, which would have been IPE, I think. Or maybe it was just IR, I can't remember now. And a couple of things happened there. One of which was they said that when they appointed me as external examiner, they didn't think I'd be very good because I had a bad reputation coming out of the York department. And then secondly, I don't know if you remember Caroline Kennedy Pipe, who was at Leeds for many years, who said that her boss in the international history department, I can't remember his name, has said that in an interview, he liked people who had a maximum of 4 sentences in answering a question. An introductory sentence, 1 or 2 sentences which elaborated, and then a concluding sentence. Now the thing is, I had actually been told by a colleague who had been an external assessor at a chair interview that I'd had in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, in Derry, Londonderry, as I believe it was called then, maybe it still is, who phoned me and said, "You talk too much in answering the questions." And a friend at Leeds said, "We expected you to mess up the interview because you had a reputation for messing up interviews. But I followed Caroline's prescriptions to the letter, and I was told afterwards it's the best interview they'd ever seen. So that's a lesson.
Yes.
If you're looking for a job, no more than 4 sentences, 3 or 4 sentences, with a strong introduction, strong conclusion, and a bit of elaboration in the middle. And that's what's got me where I am. Because Leeds was fine for 4 years. They were having some problems within the department, and then Manchester came along and kind of semi-headhunted me for the chair at Manchester. So I was at Leeds for 4 years, Manchester for 4 years, then got headhunted for this job at Rutgers Newark, and was there for 6 years before I took my early retirement.
And how did you find being back in the States?
I didn't like it. I mean, I have problems with the States, basically because if you look at the history, especially of American ideology, which is something that I really worked quite a lot on, both in high school and in college, trying to figure out American history. The thing that really annoyed me most was the belief, and it's a deeply held belief right through American society, that it's the chosen, this is the promised land, that America is superior inherently to everywhere else in the world. And that if you don't understand that, you don't understand the reality of American life. Whereas you look at the Civil War, you look at racism, you look at all sorts of things in American life, there's a snobbery, there's an ideological or philosophical snobbery about American life that I cannot stand. So I was glad to come back to Britain. Britain's got its own problems, of course, as we know, especially with Boris. But
Okay.
I don't know if you want to say anything about what you think are the big challenges for world politics as you described things before, now and into the near future.
Well, I just think that the big problems are how do you actually come up with something that deals with and is able to manage the heterarchical processes that I've been talking about, because I don't think they're manageable. I mean, when you get people like, was it Abe Newman and is it Posner writing about soft law, that soft law is not going to solve anything. The G20 hasn't solved anything. The regime complexes are not solving anything, except maybe small bits and pieces. And you get, oh yes, the phrase I was trying to think of earlier is venue shopping, where the private interests look around for, which part of the regimes that are out there are the ones that are going to promote their own private interests, and you get lobbying at the domestic level. When you put all these things together, well, I mean, I just think we might have to. Oh, also, by the way, another bit that I haven't really, that's going to go into this book chapter that I haven't really got to grips with yet, but I've got some sources to go through. Malcolm Sawyer deals with these to some extent, which is the question of the kinds of inequality that come from financialization. Because the more that the system is financialized, the more the profits actually go to those who are engaged in what we call in financial alchemy. And I think that could be a future problem down the line. And I don't see any regime that exists now being able to deal with it.
It's not a cheery prospect for the future, is it?
No. I think we're in a mess, and I don't see the world system coping with that mess.
And does neo-medievalism become more relevant in that context?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes.
And I don't know if you want to say anything about interesting scholars you're reading now. You've mentioned some as you've been going through, like Shahar and so on, Lee. But are there others that you're reading now that you would point other people to?
Well, what would I recommend? Well, I'm currently reading all sorts of stuff on finance-led capitalism and that sort of thing. I think probably the most comprehensive book, although I don't agree with everything in it, especially towards the end, is Adam Tooze's Crashed, which is a study of how the financial crash of 2007, 2008 took place and what have been the consequences of it. But I think he does, towards the end of it, or the later chapters, does go off a little bit more towards non-financial issues. But I think it's pretty thorough. It took me a long time to read, and I feel like I should read it again twice more before I say much about it. But I think that's good. I'm trying to think. I'm sure there are other ones upstairs. I mean, for example, there's a book on financialization, which has got a couple of pieces. There's an article in there by Gary Dimsky from Leeds University Business School on financialization, which I think summarizes many of the things I want to say. But I was in touch with Gary as a result of reading that chapter a couple of months ago. And he says, oh, well, actually, I'm afraid I don't really think financialization is happening. So I've got to keep my fingers crossed on that one. So there are interesting people around working on these topics.
And if you were going to if you was sitting in a cafe or at a conference, if we were allowed to be doing that again, and having a glass of wine and so on, as you described before, with somebody perhaps in the second year of their PhD, would you give them any particular advice about either intellectual advice or about career advice in terms of things to do to advance their career?
Only what I learned when I was a student at Sciences Po in 1965 to 66, which is that you write your conclusions first, or your draft conclusions first. You then divide, and this is something that I believe is taught in secondary schools in France. You then divide your sections into either 3 sections, which Aristotle talked about, or on the one hand, on the other hand, 2 big sections. And then when you finish, you go back and you write your introduction based on your draft conclusions and what you've come to in the process of studying this. And that's exactly how I wrote my PhD thesis. I wrote the introduction on the last day before I had come up against a final deadline. I've been putting it off for years. I actually wrote my PhD thesis in 6 weeks. And I wrote, and over that final weekend, before I had to have it in, I went out and played football with some friends, including some girls I fancied, and then went back, finished the introduction. The next day, went to Leeds to a thesis binder, left it with the thesis binder. By the way, typing it out on an old-fashioned typewriter with carbon copies. And then I went back on the Thursday to pick it up, took the train to Manchester, and handed it in with 2 hours to go before the deadline. I think that's quite typical of the way I work.
Is that normative advice to PhD students?
The main thing is to be thinking about the relationship between the major theoretical point you're trying to make and the case studies or the empirical material that you're having to cover.
Would you have advice to the discipline? Is there kind of, where should we be going?
Well,
if there is.
To be honest with you, I would say that that's the important thing in the subtitle of the heterarchy article that's coming out in January, towards paradigm shift in world politics. And not just world politics, political economy and world politics being essentially the same thing. I don't think you have a separate international relations and a separate international political economy. To me, they're all parts of world politics and world political economy. And so I think that we need a paradigm shift. That's my fundamental argument, and has been for 35 years. I do hope that this notion of paradigm shift takes off at other levels of both what people unfortunately call IR and IPE, because I think it will enable not just academics, but also political and social actors and to some extent economists to move away. And there's been all this literature about the weakness of markets, the concept of markets, and yet who are the decision makers? There's still people who believe that markets can be self-regulating. We're still in the Polanyi problematic. And I don't, because there isn't a world governance system to deal with it, I think we'll be in that Polanyian problematic, for a long time. And I don't want to predict what the 22nd century will be like.
If we get there.
If you get there, yes. Well, I won't get there, that's for sure.
With the project, it's about the kind of foundational scholars of international political economy. Who do you think we should interview, apart from yourself, obviously?
Yes, I'm not sure. People like Giulio Gallerati, who is the chair of the IPSA Political Power Committee, Mark Hogarth at Galway, who chaired that committee for quite a long time and still writes about the changing nature of political power. I mean, we're actually in a situation where, going back to Greek political philosophy, the concept of power is absolutely crucial at the center of what we're talking about.